Thank you very much. Mr. Stiglitz, I'd like to start with you. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. In this series, we are discussing the future of finance, and tonight we are focusing on Europe specifically. In 2016, you wrote a book about the euro, and more recently, a report came out emphasizing the necessity to rewrite the rules of the European economy. You have written extensively about Europe and the EU, which is quite remarkable for an American economist. What do you find so interesting about Europe and its economy?
Well, I think Europe has so many things that are so important for everybody in the world. The commitment to democracy, the commitment to human rights. It is, in a regional scale, a very interesting experiment, you might say, in multilateralism, bringing together a whole variety of countries and seeing whether they can organize themselves democratically to make decisions. So from a economic perspective, from a political, from a human rights, from a democracy point of view, Europe is absolutely fascinating. The book Euro it was an experiment in a monetary union over a large number of diverse countries. Economists have talked about the possibility of having shared currencies and talked about what conditions were necessary for that kind of shared currency to work well. And so for an economist, this was a very interesting experiment. And Europe didn't satisfy the conditions. They didn't develop the institutions that are necessary, and unfortunately, they still haven't done that, to make a shared currency work. And part of my motivation in writing that book was to hopefully encourage Europe to make the further advances that would allow this kind of regional agreement, a regional political unit, be more successful.
In your book, The Euro, you seem pretty skeptical about the euro's future. And in rewriting the rules of the European economy, you seem to fear that the EU might follow the path of the United States. Why should that worry us? Why should such a trajectory worry us?
Well, as an American, I can tell you I'm very worried about the future of America. We are not, if you look at what's happened in the United States, particularly over the last 40 years, it has not been very good. High levels of inequality. Almost all the growth of the last 40 years has gone to the people at the top 1%. Top 1/10 of 1%. Life expectancy in the United States today is lower than in any of the other advanced countries, and lower today than it was, say, 5 years ago. Health disparities are enormous. COVID-19 has exposed the weaknesses in our society. It has shown one of the reasons that we have been so badly afflicted. 3% of the world's population, 25% of the cases, is because of these huge disparities in income and health, lack of trust in government, lack of respect for each other. Clearly, I think anybody looking at what has been happening to our economy, to our democracy, would be worried and would not want that to happen in Europe. So as an American, I look particularly across the Atlantic and say, you are the hope for democracy and human rights. Hopefully, we'll have a renewal in the United States come November, but we won't know for another few weeks.
Taking all these things into consideration, do you still retain a belief in capitalism?
Oh, I think you cannot run a complex economy a 21st century economy without a high degree of decentralization. And part of decentralization is what I would call market economy. In my most recent book, People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent, I talk about capitalism, but it's a very different kind of capitalism than has prevailed in the past. It's much more like European social democracy. It recognizes that there is a very important role for society, for the collective, for government, for collective action. And that includes investment, public investments in education, infrastructure, health. It includes regulation, restricting pollution, exploitation, making sure the economy is competitive, and making sure that the fruits of our society are widely shared prosperity, and providing, for instance, protection. Whenever we have a crisis, we turn to government. And we've seen what 40 years of denigrating the government in the United States has resulted, a government that was not able to respond to this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis. It was a government that wasn't able to respond to Hurricane Katrina, hasn't been able to respond adequately to the wildfires, hasn't responded to the challenge of climate change. So to me, capitalism is part of the answer, but it's a different kind of capitalism than Reagan talked about or Thatcher talked about. It's a tempered capitalism that works for everybody. It's what I call progressive capitalism.
Yeah. During the corona crisis, governments all over the world have been very quick to come with new measures and to increase the money supply worldwide. How do we make sure that the money ends up in the hands of those who most need it?
Well, that's part of good democracy. The point that you're raising is a very important one, that it makes a very big difference where the money goes, both in terms of the revival of our economy and in terms of broader sense of social well-being. One of the things that's been very exposed by COVID-19 is the huge disparities in our society. I mentioned this before. One aspect of these disparities is that while the bottom half of our population, roughly, is living hand to mouth, when they don't get a paycheck, they go hungry. And large fractions of parts of America are going hungry. They don't get the health care they need. At the other part, at the top, people are actually relatively unaffected by COVID-19. And what's remarkable is in the United States, in the second quarter of this year, the savings rate soared to 25%, over 25%. This in a country where the savings rate is normally 2, 3, 4, 5%. And what does that mean? That means money given to the people at the top. They don't need that money. They're not spending the money. They're hoarding that money. They're putting in what we call precautionary balances for an even rainier day. So money that is given to the bottom is desperately needed and is going to be spent. Money given to the top just goes into the bank account. Helps stimulate the stock market. Yeah. One of the reasons our stock market is doing so well is all this money is going into these precautionary balances. But that's not making for a strong economy and a strong society.
We've seen these developments both in America and in the EU. One of the policies returning back to Europe is that you propose a EU-wide minimum wage in order, for example, for the money to end up in the good hands. How does such a one-size-fits-all policy square with the diversity of economies that we have within Europe?
Well, the reason we talked about it that way was that it is very important within a political union like the EU that you don't have a race to the bottom. The United States, we faced the same kind of issue when we first introduced the minimum wage back in the 1930s. We have large differences in the United States. The South wages were much lower than in the North and places like New England, New York. In the United States, they decided to have a uniform minimum wage. And it turned out to be of enormous benefit to the poorest parts of the country because it moved the South away from a dependence on exploiting low wages. And Texas became one of our centers for technology. Georgia did as well. It transformed that poorest part of the country and made them join the rest of the country. And they're still poor, but the gap was reduced. Now, in the case of Europe, there's a real problem of this race to the bottom. And the challenge is to try to create a prosperous Europe across the EU. Now, it may be necessary in the initial stages to have some exemptions, some variations to accommodate the differing circumstances. But the goal should be high wages everywhere.
So during the EU summit in July, the Netherlands called out the need for more market reforms in countries such as Italy and Spain in exchange for loans or grants with regard to the corona crisis. How can we make something of that political reality with your call for action regarding, on the one hand, a more equal distribution of, for example, the minimum wage in Europe, but also with your call for action regarding less market, a more dampened capitalism?
Well, I think we have to recognize that the weaknesses in both sides of the Atlantic, weaknesses that have led to this huge increase of inequality, again, on both sides of the Atlantic, worse in the United States than in Europe, but also in Europe, is that we've relied too much on unfettered markets. There's a realization that excessive focus on market alone, has not even led to higher economic growth. The era of neoliberalism where markets were put number one has been an era in which growth is actually slower than in the decades immediately after World War II. Interestingly, in the United States, among the corporate sector today, there is a rejection of this excessive focus on markets. There's a rejection of the notion that firms, for instance, should just maximize shareholder value. There's a recognition that we have to have a better sense of collective vision, that companies have to pay attention to the environment, to their customers, to their workers, to the communities in which they operate. Shareholders are important, but they're only one part of the stakeholders. And so I think what we've learned that this kind of neoliberalism focusing on just markets without adequate regulation leads to actually lower growth, with companies focusing on exploitation, whether it's market exploitation of market power, or exploiting the more vulnerable in the way that the auto companies did in selling diesel cars that were polluting the atmosphere, the scandal of Dieselgate, our pharmaceutical companies with the opioid crisis, our food companies that have led to, in the United States, a rash of childhood diabetes by pushing addictive drugs, addictive foods, the financial sector that engaged in predatory lending and abusive credit card practices. What we've seen is that these kinds of exploitative activities do not lead to an increase in the well-being of our society or even economic growth. And what we need is investments in both the private and the public sector and regulation to make sure that growth is for the benefit of everybody. So talking about investments, if we think about why is the United States, for instance, leading in the technology sector? Well, it's because the United States public, the government, made the investments for the internet. Why is it leading in so many areas, in biomedical areas? Well, it's because the government has invested so much in basic research in these areas. So in each of the areas, we need today, I believe, a better balance between the market and the government and civil society and a rich set of other institutional arrangements. The view that we need more governments, I think, more markets and just more markets is I think a short-sighted view and is belied by what has happened over the last 40 years.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Stiglitz. Thank you for your answers.